The rain fell hard against the corrugated metal roof of the small arms factory in Enfield, just north of London, as engineers huddled over technical drawings on the afternoon of November 14, 1939. Outside, the grey skies matched the mood of a nation 2 months into war with Germany. Inside, men in white coats and rolled sleeves were making a decision that would puzzle soldiers for the next 2 decades. The prototype sat on the workbench between them, an ungainly thing, really, just a steel rod with a socket on one end. 8 inches of round spike, no blade, no edge, nothing that resembled the elegant sword bayonets their fathers had carried through the mud of Flanders. One of the engineers, a man named Harrison who'd worked at Enfield since before the Great War, turned it over in his hands. The metal was cold, functional, deliberately crude. He set it down next to a patent 1907 sword bayonet, the standard issue weapon that had served at the Somme, at Passchendaele, in all those places where a generation had died. The contrast was almost comical. The 1907 gleamed 17 inches of carefully forged steel with a blade that could shave the hair off your arm. The new design looked like something a blacksmith's apprentice might have hammered out on his first day. "They'll hate it," Harrison said, not for the first time that week. His colleague, a younger man named Peterson, who'd been brought in from the Ministry of Supply, nodded without looking up from his calculations. "They'll hate being overrun without bayonets more." The mathematics of the situation were brutal and simple. Britain needed to equip not just its own army, but Commonwealth forces stretching from Canada to India. The Royal Small Arms Factory could produce rifles at an acceptable rate. The problem was the bayonets. Each patent 1907 required 17 separate manufacturing steps. The blade needed forging by skilled craftsmen, grinding to achieve the proper edge geometry, careful heat treatment to maintain hardness without brittleness, and finishing work that took hours per unit. Every step demanded specialized equipment and trained workers who simply didn't exist in the numbers required. Peterson's factory surveys told the story. Before the war, Britain had perhaps 24 facilities capable of producing proper knife bayonets. Most of those were already running maximum capacity on other weapons. The Blitz would soon reduce that capacity further. Meanwhile, intelligence estimates suggested the war might require 5 million bayonets or more. The numbers didn't work. Something had to give. By late January 1940, the first production contracts went out, not to weapons manufacturers, but to companies that made sewing machines and textile equipment. At the Singer factory in Clydebank, Scotland, workers accustomed to assembling domestic appliances found themselves retooling for war production. The spike bayonet design was so simple that the transition took weeks rather than months. No grinding wheels were needed, no skilled bladesmiths, no complex heat treatment schedules. The metal stock arrived, workers machined the socket and muzzle ring, welded or forged the spike into place, applied basic finish, and shipped the completed units to depots across Britain. The first shipments reached infantry units in the spring of 1941. The reaction was immediate and universal. Soldiers unpacked the crates, examined the crude spikes, and began inventing names. Pig sticker, pea shooter, knitting needle. One sergeant in the Hampshires reportedly held one up to his platoon and asked if anyone had ordered a tent peg by mistake. The complaints flooded up through channels. How were they supposed to open ration tins? What about cutting cord, stripping wire, the 100 daily tasks that required a blade? A bayonet was meant to be a tool, not just a weapon. This thing couldn't even spread butter. What the complaining soldiers didn't understand, what couldn't be explained in any way that would satisfy them, was that the spike bayonet embodied a truth about warfare that officers had been learning since 1918. The casualty statistics from the Great War told a story that contradicted everything in the training manuals. Bayonet wounds accounted for less than 1% of casualties on the Western Front. In some medical breakdowns, bayonet injuries were so rare They weren't tabulated separately, lumped instead with falls, equipment malfunctions, and other miscellaneous causes. At a training facility near Aldershot on March 3, 1942, Colonel Ronald Campbell addressed a group of newly commissioned officers. Campbell had served through the Great War and now ran the British Physical Training and Bayonet School. His lectures were famous for their bluntness. That afternoon, with rain pattering against the windows of the lecture hall, he told them something that would have shocked their grandfathers. "The bayonet has been obsolete as a primary killing weapon since 1914, he said, letting the words hang in the air. Young lieutenants shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This was heresy. Bayonet drill was the foundation of infantry training, the transformation that turned civilians into soldiers. Campbell continued, "The number of men actually killed by bayonet on the Western Front was very small, but as a morale booster, it was superb. Get a bayonet into the hands of despondent troops, and you can make them tigers within hours." The psychology mattered more than the steel. British training doctrine understood this, even if individual soldiers didn't. The 1937 edition of Small Arms Training Pamphlet No. 12 stated the principle clearly. The use of the bayonet, or the threat of it, would often enable infantry to drive the enemy from his position or cause him to surrender. The threat of the bayonet, not the wound it might inflict, but the terror it inspired. By late May 1941, British and Commonwealth forces on Crete were learning this lesson in the hardest way possible. The German airborne invasion had thrown the island into chaos. Australian and New Zealand units had been retreating for 7 days, fighting running battles through the mountains while German mountain troops pressed them toward the sea. At a position the troops called 42nd Street, near the village of Galatas, the 28th Maori Battalion found itself out of options on the afternoon of May 27th. The sun was setting behind the hills when Lieutenant Colonel Fred Baker assessed his situation. His battalion had been fighting continuously since the German paratroops landed. Ammunition was critically low. Many men had fired their last rounds. German forces from the 141st Mountain Regiment blocked the only route south to evacuation ships waiting at Sfakia. The numbers were simple. Without ammunition, the battalion would be overrun by morning. With it, they might break through. What happened next became legend in New Zealand military history, though the details remain debated. According to multiple accounts, a Maori soldier whose name was never recorded picked up a Bren gun, stood atop a stone wall, and began performing a haka. The traditional war dance, with its fierce chanting and aggressive movements, dated back centuries before European contact. Other soldiers joined him. Within moments, the entire battalion was participating, the ancient Maori war cry echoing across the Mediterranean hillside as the sun touched the horizon. Then they fixed bayonets. The order moved down the line in near silence. The metallic clicks of bayonets locking onto rifle muzzles provided percussion to the chanting. These weren't the elegant sword bayonets of 1914. They were crude steel spikes, pig stickers that couldn't open a tin of bully beef. But fixed to the end of a Lee Enfield rifle, each one extended the soldier's reach by 10 inches. Each one transformed a firearm into a spear. They walked forward. Baker recorded that detail specifically in his after-action report filed 3 weeks later in Cairo. His men didn't charge, didn't run. They walked as if on parade, maintaining formation, keeping pace, bayonets leveled. The German positions were 200 yards away, then 100. At 50 yards, the first German machine gun opened fire. Men fell. The line closed ranks and kept walking. They reached the first German trench just as the light failed. What followed was close-quarters fighting of a sort that wasn't supposed to happen in modern warfare. Bayonets against machine pistols, steel against flesh at arm's length. Baker wrote that his men bayoneted or Tommy gunned the Germans in the first position, then walked onto the next line. The German defense started to crack. Then it broke completely. Mountain troops, elite soldiers trained for exactly this kind of fighting, fled rather than face the advancing bayonets. The charge drove German forces back over 1,500 meters. When burial parties counted bodies the following morning, they found 280 German casualties. 121 men from the 141st Mountain Regiment's 1st Battalion had been killed by bayonets and rifle butts. The action opened the route to Slovakia. Over the next 3 days, more than 16,000 Allied troops evacuated from the island. Cold steel had accomplished what artillery and air support could not. 13 months later, on June 27, 1942, similar mathematics applied in the Western Desert. The 2nd New Zealand Division found itself surrounded near Minkar Qaim, a position roughly 40 miles from the Egyptian border. Rommel's Afrika Korps had encircled them during the long retreat from Gazala. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. The only route out was directly through German lines. The breakout began at 2330 hours. Under cover of darkness, the division formed up for a bayonet assault. Lieutenant Charles Upham, already holder of 1 Victoria Cross for actions on Crete, moved with his company through the German perimeter. His account, recorded weeks later while recovering from wounds, described going straight through Jerry's groups of slit trenches, leaving those not immediately dealt with for the following troops, who by then were charging with the usual Maori roar and battle cry. The fighting lasted through the night. Private Stanley Gurney charged 3 machine gun positions in succession, killing the crews with bayonet and grenades before German fire cut him down. He received a posthumous Victoria Cross. Private Percy Gratwick won the same honour for a bayonet assault on an enemy strongpoint, also awarded posthumously. These weren't parade ground heroics. They were desperate men with steel-tipped rifles doing what ammunition shortage demanded. The 2nd New Zealand Division broke through. German forces had every advantage in firepower, position, and numbers. What they couldn't match was the psychological impact of men willing to close to arm's length. By dawn on June 28th, the division was clear of encirclement and moving east toward Allied lines. Back in Britain, production of the pig sticker continued at an accelerating pace. By mid-1942, the design had been simplified 3 times. The Mark I, with its beautifully machined cruciform spike featuring 4 flutes running the length of the blade, had proven too expensive even in its simplicity. 75,000 were produced before cost pressures demanded changes. The Mark II eliminated the expensive milling entirely, replacing the cruciform with a simple round spike. Over 3 million of these rolled off production lines at factories that had never made weapons before the war. At Lewisham Engineering in South London, workers in a bombed-out facility welded together the Mark II Star variant. This design separated the blade and socket into 2 pieces, creating a visible step joint where they met. The quality was rougher, the finish less refined, but each bayonet performed its function. Another 1.5 million were manufactured. The Mark III abandoned any pretense of craftsmanship. Joseph Lucas Limited, a company that normally produced automotive components, stamped these bayonets from 7 pieces of sheet steel welded together with no attempt to smooth the joints. Black paint covered the crude finish. Workers who'd been making headlamps and electrical components now produced weapons. Nearly 200,000 Mark IIIs entered service. They were ugly, utilitarian, and absolutely sufficient for their purpose. When British production capacity maxed out, manufacturing moved overseas. At the Long Branch Arsenal near Toronto, Canadian workers produced over 900,000 spike bayonets between 1942 and 1945. Savage Arms in New York State manufactured 1.25 million under Lend-Lease agreements. A British soldier in Burma might carry a spike made in Scotland. His mate beside him could have one stamped in Canada. The New Zealander to their left might have an American-made version. All of them looked identical. All of them worked exactly the same way. At the Royal Ordnance Factory in Fatakally, near Liverpool, quality control inspectors checked random samples from each production run on October 12, 1943. The specifications were simple compared to knife bayonets. The spike needed to be the correct length, the socket had to fit the rifle's barrel, and the locking mechanism needed to engage properly. No edge testing, no hardness checks beyond basic standards, no examination of blade geometry. An inspector could check 100 spike bayonets in the time it took to properly inspect a dozen knife types. This simplicity enabled the scale that warfare demanded. By war's end, nearly 5 million No. 4 spike bayonets had been produced across 3 countries and dozens of factories. Every rifle in British Commonwealth service could be equipped. Reserves filled depots from Singapore to Cairo. The industrial achievement was remarkable precisely because it was so unremarkable. Britain had designed a weapon that anyone could make. German soldiers carried the Seitengewehr 8498, a knife bayonet with a 9.9-inch blade that could serve as a fighting knife when detached. German manufacturers included companies like Dürkop, makers of motor vehicles, and Mundlos, a sewing machine company. Even while dispersing production across civilian factories, Germany maintained the knife blade design because German doctrine expected the bayonet to function as a tool. American troops carried knife bayonets throughout the war, initially the long M1905, later shortened variants better suited to modern combat. Both nations understood that soldiers needed utility function. The British spike couldn't open a tin, it couldn't cut cord. It was nearly useless as a field implement, yet photographs from the war years show something interesting. German and American soldiers rarely appear with bayonets fixed in combat photographs. The weapons stay in scabbards until needed. British and Commonwealth troops are almost always photographed with spikes mounted on their rifles. Doctrine demanded it. The psychological effect on both the carrier and anyone facing him outweighed practical utility concerns. After the war ended, rumors spread about the spike bayonet. Stories circulated that the Geneva Convention had banned triangular or cruciform bayonets because the wounds they created couldn't be sutured. This was false. No such prohibition exists in any international humanitarian law. The Geneva Conventions of 1949 make no mention of triangular or spike bayonets. The British No. 4 remained in service through the 1960s, which would have been impossible if internationally banned. The medical claims had some basis in reality, though exaggerated. Triangular wounds do present challenges for traditional suturing techniques, which rely on clean edges. Historical records confirm cruciform blades created wounds that were difficult to close. But difficult didn't mean impossible. Civil War medical records document successful treatment. Modern surgical studies have established effective techniques for closing triangular wounds. The spike bayonet created nasty injuries, certainly, but no more deliberately cruel than any other weapon of war. The British military establishment knew soldiers hated the pig sticker. Work began immediately after the war on the No. 9 Mark I knife bayonet, which combined a proper blade with the No. 4's socket mounting system. Over 500,000 were produced by 1956. The military couldn't get rid of the spike fast enough, as one researcher later noted. Yet the weapon served far longer than its unpopularity suggested. The Lee Enfield wasn't officially replaced until 1957, and No. 4 rifles persisted in cadet force stores into the mid-1980s. The L42A1 sniper variant, using the No. 4 platform, served into the 1990s. For decades after the war, British soldiers trained with the spike their grandfathers had carried at El Alamein and their fathers had used in Korea. On a grey afternoon in November 1965, exactly 26 years after the War Office approved the design, a platoon of recruits at a training depot near Catterick fixed bayonets for drill practice. The weapons were the same crude spikes that had been issued in 1941. The sergeant instructor, a veteran of Malaya, demonstrated the thrust and parry movements that had been standard since Wellington's time. The techniques hadn't changed. The ugly steel rods on the end of their rifles connected these teenagers to centuries of military tradition. The No. 4 spike bayonet represented a brutal calculation made in desperation and maintained through necessity. Britain needed millions of bayonets immediately, and proper knife bayonets required skilled labour and specialised equipment that didn't exist in sufficient quantity. The spike could be manufactured by sewing machine factories, by textile machinery companies, by anyone with basic metalworking capability. Soldiers complained about losing their utility tool. Officers noted the reduced reach compared to the patent 1907. None of that mattered because the weapon's true purpose was psychological, and psychology didn't require an edge. The calculus was simple and cold. A soldier without a bayonet was just a rifleman. A soldier with a bayonet, even a crude spike that couldn't cut butter, was something more. He was a threat at any range. He had a weapon that worked when ammunition ran out. He carried steel that connected him to every infantryman who'd ever fixed a blade and advanced toward the enemy. When ammunition ran out on Crete, when the Africa Corps surrounded the New Zealand division at Minkar Kaim, when desperate men faced impossible odds across a dozen battlefields from Libya to Burma, cold steel performed exactly as military psychology predicted. Fixed bayonets transformed desperate men into attacking forces. They made enemies flee rather than face the blade. The specific shape of the bayonet mattered far less than its presence. German soldiers facing British bayonet charges didn't calculate the manufacturing cost of the weapon coming toward them. They didn't critique the design efficiency or mock the crude finish. They saw death at arm's length, held by men who had nothing left to lose. That fear was the point. The crude spike that soldiers mocked as a pig-sticker worked because bayonet combat was never really about the bayonet. It was about the psychology of violence at intimate range, the ancient terror of edged weapons that outweighed every rational calculation about modern firepower. British engineering solved the bayonet problem not by building a better weapon, but by building exactly the right weapon for the industrial reality of total war. 5 million pig stickers armed the force that fought from Dunkirk to Berlin. The soldiers who carried them hated the design. The enemies who faced them feared it anyway. That contradiction was the point all along.